involve our guest speaker, Dr. Nick Tiller, who has joined us from Norway. What part of Norway are you in right now, Nick?
So I'm zooming from Auskirk, which is about 1 hour east of Oslo.
Okay.
I don't live here, just for full disclosure. I came back to the UK just before the lockdown started, and then obviously the borders closed, and not being a US citizen, I couldn't get back in. So I'm stuck in Europe for the time being.
Oh, man.
That's a bit rough.
It's a bit rough, but I can think of worse places to be. Norway's pretty beautiful, so I'm quite
true.
lucky
Yeah.
to be stranded here.
So are you far enough south that you wouldn't be as impacted by the winter nights and the summer days?
Yeah, I mean, we still get a bit of that. So at nighttime during the summer, certainly, it never gets completely dark. It's always kind of twilight, but we're far enough south so that it's during the winter you barely get any sunlight at all. But you're right, you have to be further north, further to the pole for it to be kind of 24-hour sunshine. But no, it's not quite that bad here.
Well, that's good. I guess you can still get a tan, or kind of work on a tan then.
Well, I'm English, don't forget.
Maybe.
We don't tan.
That's true. All right. Well, I don't want to hold anybody longer than necessary, so I'm going to just go ahead and we'll kick this off. And I mean, if it stays about this size, we can pause for questions as we go. But if we end up getting probably like 5 or more people, then we'll put questions on pause until the end. And
What happened to everyone? This is as
got
many people
me.
as been here. Oh my God!
It's all right. No, because I had invited all the faculty and I invited all the first-year grad students. But 2 weeks ago, people probably lost it in their email and forgot about it. So yeah, we'll just go ahead and get started. So I just want to introduce everybody to Dr. Nicholas Tiller. Nick is a research fellow in respiratory medicine and exercise physiology at the Harbor-UCLA Medical Center up in the LA area. And I'll let him tell us a little bit about his background, where his education was, PhD work, research interest, personal info, et cetera. And then we'll kind of move into our discussion for the day from there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Schubert. I have a couple of slides, if you'll permit me to share them, if I can share my screen with you.
Yeah, just 1 second here.
I rarely get an opportunity to talk about myself, so I thought this would be a good chance to, show you some slides and give you a bit more of my background.
So you should be a co-host now, so you should be able to screen share.
All right, great. Okay, it's literally like 3 or 4 slides. I just thought it might facilitate the discussion, and I can give you a bit more of a visual kind of outline as to where I've come from. So as you've probably guessed by now, I did my education in the UK, and I did an undergraduate degree and my master's in exercise physiology. In the UK, it's pretty much referred to as sports science, but the curriculum is almost identical to what you'd study in kinesiology. So that was from 2002 to 2007, did my undergrad and my postgrad there as well. And then I knew at this time, let's go back a little bit, I knew at this time that I wanted to work in elite sport. I became very obsessive over wanting to work with elite athletes and elite coaches. So during my master's, I volunteered a lot of my time because that's what you've got to do to accumulate the experience. And I was very fortunate towards the end of 2007 to get a job at the English Institute of Sport, which is modeled on the Australian Institute of Sport. It's a very similar system. And the EIS is the service provider of choice to the Olympic performance programs. So I was based in the southeast of England at this place, Bisham Abbey, and I worked with athletics, rowing, and kayaking full time for 2 years. It was a great experience, but the one thing that I felt a little bit disillusioned by working in elite sport was that the science wasn't necessarily as rigorous as it could have been. Anybody who's got experience working in high-level sport, you'll see that there's something of a dichotomy between the rigorousness of the science and the applied nature of the practice. And yes, it is possible to marry the two, but more often than not on the Olympic program, certainly the science is sacrificed a little bit for the sake of performance. So I decided at that point that I was actually in love with the science more than I was with the sports. So I left to go and do my PhD at Brunel University in West London, and that was in respiratory physiology. I worked with my mentor, Dr. Lee Romer, who's a very well-established respiratory physiologist. And then when I left Brunel, after a couple of temporary appointments, I started at Sheffield Hallam University, which is kind of halfway up the United Kingdom, sort of halfway between London and Scotland. And I became an associate professor there, and I left in 2019. It was
Nick,
around this time.
Were you there? Sorry to interrupt. Were you there in 2018 at SHU in 2018?
Yes. Yeah.
Did we meet?
Mm-hmm.
Did we? Because I was over there. I was over there that summer with David Broom, and you guys had a little retreat. It was like the week before ECSS when it was in Dublin.
Where was the retreat? Do you remember? It's possible that we met.
It was in Sheffield. It was at the.
Yeah.
It was like a fancy castle hotel house thing.
I know that one
I'd
of
have
those retreats I didn't make. So but yeah, it's possible. I'll have to search my memory banks. But yeah,
me
it's
too.
possible that we've already met.
It's just funny. Yeah.
Yeah, and Dave Brum is still in touch with Dave. He's a good guy.
Yeah, he's great.
So yeah, and that's another lesson to take away from this is that the world of sports science is very, very small. Everybody knows everybody. There's like 1 or 2 degrees of separation between everyone. So yeah, so I'm not surprised. But so I left at Sheffield Hallam at the end of 2019 to take up this new opportunity at UCLA, and I work now specifically at the Lundquist Institute, which is at the Harbor-UCLA campus. This is a picture of me with some of my colleagues. 2 of the other postdocs at either end of the line. There's Dr. Janos Porzas, and then I'm standing next to Professor Richard Casaburi, who's a very well-renowned exercise physiologist, and he pretty much did all of the early groundwork in pulmonary rehabilitation, and he did his postgraduate studies with Carl Wasserman and Brian Whipp. So it's kind of a very well-respected institution. He's been messing around in the lab. And here, my research kind of focuses on 2 main themes. It's respiratory function in COPD. So we focus specifically on patient populations, exercise tolerance as well. It's first and foremost an exercise physiology lab. And I have a specific interest in ultra endurance physiology, which it's not as far removed from the patient populations as you might think. We can kind of take lessons from both and apply them. In addition to all my research and stuff, as you might have guessed, I'm very, very passionate about scientific skepticism and critical thinking, and I've been writing for many years and talking about the importance of evidence-based practice and skepticism, particularly in the health and fitness industry. And that's obviously the major theme of today's session. And then just to finish, one other thing that is vaguely interesting about me is that I'm into ultramarathon running, and I've been running ultramarathons for over a decade now, and I've done some pretty big races. This is me in the Sahara Desert back in 2012, I think it was. Me in the Scottish Highlands, and then this is a little bit more familiar to you guys, the Rainbow Trail, which is in the Santa Monica Mountains. And in the last couple of years, I've been able to marry my passion for ultramarathon with my scientific research. So I've published a few papers looking at the physiology and pathophysiology of ultra endurance sport. So that is me in a nutshell. Hope I didn't bore anyone with that, and I'll hand back to Matt to take it forwards.
Yeah, great. Thanks for all that, Nick. And I'm sure we'll come back and talk a little bit about some of those experiences and kind of what you've how you've evolved as a researcher and a reader of research, I guess. So I think a good place for us to start then would be to define what research is, and also to define what evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine is. So I have some definitions. I'm open to kind of hearing your interpretation, and we can kind of go back and forth. You're still on mute. Hold on. There you go.
So why don't you kick off and I'll feed off you. I'm keen to know
Sure.
what your
So the definitions that I have, the definition for research is the systematic approach, so a thorough approach to obtaining and confirming new and reliable knowledge. And then if you want to break that down, it has to be systematic and orderly, which means it has to follow a series of steps and some sort of guiding plan. And the idea is to generate new knowledge that is going to be reliable and hopefully add to the larger literature base. And then kind of the final point is that, research is a cycle. So in theory, it should always be leading to more questions, or what's the next study or the follow-up. So that's how we're kind of defining research in the context of this course. I know other people may have different definitions. And then as a follow-up to that, some of you might be familiar with the term evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine. There's a few different definitions out there, but the simplest one is that it is an integration of the best research evidence with clinical expertise and considerations for patient values in order to get the best clinical outcomes. So it's an umbrella term for basically marrying research and practice, because there are many examples in the medicine field, in our field, of the research and the evidence not always being appropriately applied versus interpreted. And just as like a quick example, I'm going to ask one of our faculty who's joined us, Dr. Jamie Hibbert, who is a licensed athletic trainer, to give us an example or two of how that is, how evidence-based practice has evolved in her field.
Yeah, so I was nodding and kind of smiling as Dr. Tiller was talking about at high level athletics. You see this disconnect between, oh, well, this is what we do, whether it's in training or as medical practice or whatever, with here's the best evidence of what we should do. It's kind of this battle with the way we've always done it versus what really we could be doing to optimize, whether it's recovery or performance or injury evaluation even. And so one really, really simple thing that came to mind when Dr. Schubert was asking me to kind of think about this was the use of tuning forks to identify fractures or stress fractures even. It's, oh, well, it'll cause vibrations and this will be an easy way to identify stress fractures. I know people who still do this, even though there is no evidence really to suggest that this is both, a specific or sensitive way to identify this. And we have technology that's so easy, especially at higher levels of athletics, to identify stress fractures. But probably the bigger area where we have seen good evolution of clinical practice is where it comes to head trauma, specifically concussions in sport. Thankfully, we're seeing a move, I think a lot to do with the sports where there is high levels of concussive event being very popular, especially in the US. So football, and then soccer in the rest of the world as well as the US. But when I was in school, it was amazing because there were still people who it's, oh, well, you can't be sure that someone actually had a concussion unless they lost consciousness. And we know now there's overwhelming evidence that that's not the case. And so it's very interesting looking at all of the tools that have come out of the research, and the way that we're able to use that now is making a direct impact on clinical practice.
Yeah, and you touched on something there that kind of resonated with me, because one of the things that I tried to do in my kind of much broader science communication role is to get people to understand that we have these very kind of, I guess, almost dictionary definitions of research and evidence-based practice, and I don't disagree with either of those that were put forwards, but what I'm interested in is how we can apply those principles to a broader context and how we can use them in everyday life. Because I'm very much about trying to get people who are non-scientists, primarily scientists and budding scientists and academics and practitioners, to do this stuff. But I think anybody, even without a science background, can do research, not necessarily research in a lab, but they can do research, and they can embody the ethos of evidence-based practice in their everyday lives. So one technique, for example, or one exercise that I've used in the past with my own students was to get them to think about the last time they made a significant investment on something, a financial investment. It may have been buying a new car or an expensive laptop or a new mobile phone, or whatever it happens to be, something that was a substantial amount of money, a decision that you didn't want to rush into. Now, did you just go out and pick up the first one that you could find? Probably not. Did you go on the way that it looked? Well, maybe a little bit. Did you go into a store and ask the salesman or saleswoman to recommend you a device? Well, maybe you would have done, but you wouldn't have taken what they said for granted. You wouldn't have assumed they were telling you the truth. But okay, you'd incorporate some of that as well. And then you'd think about, okay, well, what are my needs and what are the specifications that I'm looking for? Is there any evidence or proof that this thing is going to perform the way that people are telling me it's going to perform? You'll speak to other people. You'd look at some online reviews, and you do all this data collection. You're looking at all these different sources, and you'd integrate all of these different ideas and perceptions, and that's research. And then on the weight of all of this evidence, you would try to come to some kind of informed conclusion as to which one was the right car or mobile phone or laptop for you. And part of the problem is in today's society is that people are just making decisions without really having them informed decisions. They're just kind of using their gut, using their intuition. And intuition, maybe we'll get to it later, is fundamentally flawed. You cannot believe what you think. So we bring it back to research and evidence-based practice. That's why we need research. That's why we need studies. That's why we need something objective to help us to come to a valid conclusion, because perceptions are flawed. So, that's kind of a really important theme that comes out of this whole idea of evidence-based practice.
No, that's a good point. And it ties into something that I was almost afraid to bring up, because I was anticipating a larger group where it might be a little bit more controversial. But I feel like your point there ties in well to our own biases, and how that influences our interpretation of the results or the literature. Like, I'll throw myself under the bus here. I am about as anti-ketogenic diet and keto, low carb, high fat zealot as you can get, because you can't have you can't have an argument with those people, because they are 100% convinced in their mind that their position is the correct one and the only one. And so anytime I see a paper from certain people in that field, I will usually read the abstract and I will usually read the title, but generally there have been times where I will dismiss those papers out of hand just because I'm aware of the authors and the agenda that they are pushing that I do not agree with. And as a researcher, that should not be something that I have. But we all have our own inherent biases, and learning how to overcome them is also part of the research and the learning process. I don't know if you want to chime in and kind of add anything to that from your experience, Nick, or.
So I wrote about this specific subject in a section called Carbohydrates, Vaccinations, and the Pope, right? Because it comes back to the key word of ideology. Now, I'm not for or against ketogenic diets, and I have deliberately, a number of times over the years when I've been in discussions or been interviewed for something, and I've been deliberately kind of provoked into sitting on, one camp, sitting in one camp or the other, and I've always sat on the fence to make a very important point. And fundamentally, we have to understand that experience and perception by definition is subjective, okay? And all of your experience, all of our experiences are filtered every second of every day by your, we have inherent filters that help us to navigate the world on a day-to-day basis. So some certain key bits of information we'll log. 99% of the data that we're bombarded with every day we ignore. We wouldn't be able to manage in today's society if that weren't the case. But the data that is filtered out and the data that is logged in your memory is very much dependent on your biases, your pre-existing experiences, your expectations, so on and so forth. And this whole idea of, I love talking about the ketogenic diet thing because it's a great example of how people often make up their minds about something before they really know anything about the literature. Now, I've read a lot of this literature on low carbohydrate diets. I know the mechanisms or the proposed mechanisms better than most, but I don't feel like I understand the area well enough to really sit in one camp or the other. I deliberately sit on the fence because I don't really feel like I understand it. I haven't read all of the studies and I can't make an unbiased, objective decision as to which camp I'll fall in. There are people who have already made up their minds on this topic, who understand this area a lot less comprehensively than I do. Some people have read 20% of the literature that I have, and they've already made up their minds, okay? And this is the definition of ideology. When you don't look at facts objectively, when your decisions are biased by your pre-existing beliefs, what we call a confirmation bias, then that's the definition of ideology. And they've studied this. There's a couple of really nice Harvard studies. They've got a group of students. I think the situation was, the scenario was corporal punishment. You had half of the group who believed that corporal punishment was a positive and half the group that were very anti-corporal punishment. And they were each given some completely fabricated research. So some journal articles that looked like they'd been published in reputable journals. And the group that were for corporal punishment were given a paper that supported their pre-existing beliefs. And then immediately afterwards, they were given a paper that contrasted with their beliefs. And the other group were given the same two papers. By the end of the review, after they'd read both papers, the groups had diverged in their opinions even more. And the group that were for corporal punishment decided that the paper that supported their pre-existing beliefs was really rigorous and sound, and it was good science, and it was in a good journal. And the paper that was against their beliefs was in a crappy journal and was fundamentally flawed and couldn't be trusted, and it should be thrown out. The other group found the exact opposite. So this is the essence of confirmation bias. And it's important that we understand, it comes back to this idea that our inherent faculties are flawed. The whole point of science is to try and minimize as much as we can our biases. You can never eliminate them, but you put safeguards in place to eliminate the biases as much as possible.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great point. And just to add a little bit of substance to my position, I do believe there are situations where the ketogenic diet can work. We have evidence that it works for epilepsy, weight loss, diabetes, number of other health conditions. The one where there seems to be a lot of contentious debate is endurance exercise. And we had some very well-designed, I think, are well-designed studies out of probably one of the best research groups in the world, out of Louise Burke's lab and group in Australia, that have shown twice now that in the context of an Olympic sport, in this case race walking, going onto a ketogenic diet does not seem to have a benefit. Now, that doesn't mean that the results from that study could not necessarily be applied to ultra endurance athletes who might be in a better position to benefit from the ketogenic diet. But those studies haven't been done really, to my knowledge, I don't think have really been done. And so we don't have that evidence. And so if you were working with somebody who was going to do a 100-mile race and they asked about a keto diet, you would have to make your own judgment on whether or not it would be appropriate for them to do that. I guess that kind of brings us, I think, to the next point that I wanted to talk about, which was the hierarchy of evidence, so to speak. And I'm just going to pull up it's not the best picture, but I do have a pyramid of evidence, so to speak, contrasting the evidence-based side with the pseudoscience side. And if you're not familiar with the term pseudoscience, that is just another word for a collection of beliefs or practices that people mistakenly believe are based on the scientific method. But you can hopefully see this hierarchy of evidence here. Down at the bottom is your lowest level. And that starts with expert opinions or editorials on the evidence-based side. And I read it somewhere on the pseudoscience side. And then you work your way up on the evidence side. The next step would be case reports and case series. So those case reports, those are those N of 1 or very small studies on a limited number of individuals. And then from there, you start to move into the larger studies, the case control, the cohorts, the RCTs. And then the top of the evidence pyramid would be systematic reviews or meta-analyses as kind of the gold standard according to evidence-based medicine. And then you can kind of see on the pseudoscience side that there's no real source of information there. And so I guess now the discussion should be, or maybe we can talk about how we deal with the hierarchy of evidence in kind of the sports science kinesiology field. Do we do a good job of following this template?
I'd say on the most part we do. I actually I've not seen this before, and I love this. I'm going to use this again if you don't mind.
For sure.
I think it's great. And don't forget, whenever, I don't know if you guys think back to the last time you read a systematic review, but I've only ever written one systematic review, and it took a long time because you have to be so rigorous with your methods, and you have to be very clear and transparent with respect to what your different categories of evidence are. So you can't just throw in any studies you like. You have to be very clear if they are randomized controlled trials. You, for the most part, if you're going to use a case series or a case report, you have to be very clear in the text that this is from a single subject or it's low quality data. You have to be careful not including trials that don't have control groups and all these types of things. And these are fundamental practices to ensure that we're doing good, rigorous research and good, rigorous science in all these categories on the left. The main difference for me between the left and right side is when we have evidence-based practice, once again, we're trying to minimize bias and we're trying to look at a particular scenario objectively, right? The pseudoscience side, or pseudoscience, however you want to pronounce it, is the opposite of that. It's embellishing this subjective interpretation of things. I mean, how many of you, for example, were told when you were a kid that you yawn to get more oxygen to the brain? You know, I was told that. How many of you were told that you shouldn't go swimming after eating because you get cramp? How many of you were told that cramping is due to electrolyte imbalances?
Dehydration, yep.
A little bit more. Yeah, dehydration. And I could go on and on about things that we've heard somewhere that we just repeat because we think that it's common wisdom, common knowledge. Actually, there's no evidence for any of these things, and you can delve as deep as you like, and you'll come back to many examples of this. So the main
Lactic
difference between the
acid.
left and right side is lactic acid is a great one because it's still blamed in many circles for causing muscle fatigue, and we've known since the 1980s that it doesn't. But it's but people like a simple answer for things. People like to, you know, it's a scapegoat. We can blame lactic acid. But so
Well,
the
I
difference
think
between
that,
the left and right side is objective versus subjective.
yeah, and that ties, your last comment there kind of ties in with, you know, people looking for the quick fix. And I think I admittedly am not too far along into your book there, but I really enjoyed the discussion of snake oil and kind of the history behind that. And so if you maybe want to do kind of a brief discussion on, or just briefly explain the history behind snake oil and kind of how that started the whole, well, or basically, you know, well, yeah, I'll let you kind of decide how you want to navigate it.
Yeah, so we use the term snake oil kind of, it goes in conjunction with this term pseudoscience. And pseudoscience is kind of unproven or very unscientific treatments. So pseudo meaning false or fake. And when we use the term snake oil, we're essentially referring to some kind of treatment that is unproven and that works purely on the premise of suggestibility. And I start the book by giving this very kind of whimsical, creative account of the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a very long stretch of railway that was put together in the 1800s in the Old West, and the Confederate and Chinese workers who were responsible for laying the track and digging the tunnels and things, they would complain obviously of muscle soreness and joint pain and so forth. And the Chinese workers started to rub oil from the Chinese water snake onto their joints to ease the pain. And they espoused the health benefits of this oil, and they started to pass it around to their co-workers. Before long, snake oil was this very, very popular treatment. Now, there's absolutely no evidence that snake oil has any active ingredient that could work as an analgesic. And actually, when it was finally tested in the early 1900s, when they developed analytical chemistry to look at the various components of the snake oil treatments, it was found to have turpentine and camphor and so forth, but actually didn't have any pain-relieving ingredients. But it didn't really matter because snake oil was sold in these big theatrical, I suppose, what's the word?
Production?
I suppose just big theatrical production lines. People would go around in touring buses, and they'd have, you've probably seen it on TV or in the movies, somebody would come up with a limp and drink this snake oil preparation, and then they'd pretend to be cured, you know, and it was somebody planted in the audience. And the reason that snake oil was so wildly popular is because everyone was, number one, they were pretty much scientifically illiterate at that time. And the second thing was that they didn't have the ways or means to test the actual ingredients to see if there was any efficacy, if there was any truth behind the claims that were being made. And snake oil still exists today, but instead of actually being a snake oil product, it's supplements and training garments and pills and powders and potions and running trainers and minimalist shoes and compression tights and keto diets. It's all the same stuff. It's just as unproven as snake oil was in the 1800s. And I'll quickly, just to end the anecdote, I think it's useful to think about why we are drawn to these quick fixes. And it's because humans have evolved logic and reason for navigating hypersocial groups. And these inherent kind of ingrained faculties are really poorly suited to our current culture, which is saturated by fake news and bad science and social media. Society has changed, modern society has changed much faster than our critical faculties have been able to adapt. And our genes really haven't changed that much in the last 10,000 years, you know, our pre-human ancestors. And but society has moved at this rapid pace that outstrips our abilities to adapt from an evolutionary perspective. So it's almost like we're bringing knives to a gunfight, really, because we don't have the inherent cognitive capacities to be able to navigate this very commercialist big business culture that is characterized by the internet and social media, and we're bombarded every day with so much data. So that's kind of a brief history of snake oil and actually why these products are so popular today.
Yeah, that's great. And you tied it in perfectly with the modern supplements. So for those of you who aren't aware, a lot of supplements escape scrutiny and also testing because they aren't marketed as a food. They're marketed as a dietary supplement, and the FDA does not currently have any sort of structure in place to have those approved or to have those tested or to have those quality controlled. So like even from companies you might consider reputable, the example I am thinking of here, I think is Cellucor C4, I think, which is a pretty popular pre-workout. And some colleagues of mine from Australia, including my PhD mentor, Ben Desborough, did a test where they took the powder to quantify the caffeine content, not only from one bottle or one, jar. They took a scoop from the top. They also took one from the bottom, and then they tested other batches. And the variability in the caffeine content of this one supplement produced supposedly the same way with all the same ingredients was quite high. The variability in the caffeine content from not only one batch, but even from the top of the container versus the bottom of the container. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I can definitely share the paper with you guys because it all just comes back to these supplement companies. Probably 95% of them, they don't really care about your health. They're just seeing dollar signs. And, in order to be an educated consumer, you need to know what is in a product. And another way that a lot of these companies get around kind of the laws is they use things like proprietary blend or proprietary ingredients, but then they don't tell you what that stuff is. And so again, coming back to most people probably don't care, but I think given our role as health professionals, it is our job to care about that stuff. And then I guess that kind of takes me to kind of the next point of, what tools can we use to learn to be skeptical of these snake oil claims. So for those of you who are not familiar with the definition, skeptical means that you're not easily convinced or that you may have doubts or reservations about something. So I think now the logical path for the discussion is to discuss how we can potentially be skeptical in our field. And what that might mean from a kinesiology standpoint.
If it's okay, I'd like to dwell on the supplements.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Industry just for a moment, because I think there's some important takeaways, and then I'll link it back to evidence-based practice. I'll throw a quick question out to the group. How many supplements do you guys think are currently available to buy worldwide? If you had to have a guess, how many different supplements, dietary supplements, do you think are available? Somebody just throw out a number, a sensible number.
50,000.
50,000. Okay. Anyone else?
I'd go 6 digits or something.
I'm thinking millions.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I was expecting you to start low, and then I was going to surprise you by saying it's 30,000. But maybe if you think about the broad marketability of these things, to have 30,000 different dietary supplements available worldwide is actually a horrifying number, and it's growing exponentially. So at a rate of about 4,000 a year, 4,000 different dietary supplements. The fact that Dr. Schubert mentioned the FDA, and I think this is an important one because it links into our discussion of being skeptics in the broadest sense. Anybody can produce a supplement. Literally, anybody can produce a supplement, and they can make certain claims about it. You can't make any claims. There was new legislation brought in 2012, but the FDA won't prohibit the sale of a supplement unless there is evidence that it's harmful. Okay, so think about it this way. You produce a supplement, you don't have to prove that it's safe. You can start selling it, and the FDA will only stop you from selling it if there's evidence that it's harmful. That's pretty backwards, right? And there have been many instances where people have been getting sick by taking certain supplements, and then the FDA decide to, they spring into action and stop people from getting hurt. Ephedrine used to be widely available, and tens of thousands of people got very, very sick and ended up being hospitalized because they were overdosing on ephedrine. And it took tens of thousands of people to get sick before the FDA got off their asses. And the other thing to I guess, acknowledge specifically with the supplement industry is that it used to be just fair game. You could produce a supplement and make any outrageous claims that you wanted to about that supplement. Now, new legislation came into force in 2012 worldwide that prohibited that. So if you make a very specific claim about your supplement, there has to be a reasonable kind of a research base to support the claim. Now, what's meant by reasonable, nobody really knows. It's quite ambiguous. It's like 2 studies done in a lab somewhere. So rather than doing research the right way, which would be to get this nice body of research, to do some rigorous science, data collection in a lab, and have double-blind groups and all of these things that we understand by when we say good scientific processes, and then basing a supplement off of the positive data, what supplement companies have now done is they've got their supplements all ready to go, and they're making claims about the supplements. They then employ research and development teams to retrospectively go back and do the scientific studies to prove positive the claims that they've already made. And that's kind of a way, a loophole to get around the whole process. So technically they're not doing anything wrong because they're still doing the research, but it's a backward system. That's not how good research is done. Just to kind of bring it back to the original point, which was how to be a skeptic and how to be skeptical in this industry. It's important that you guys understand the difference between being a skeptic and a cynic, because people often use the word, you're such a skeptic, as like a derogatory term. And I don't see it like that at all. Being a cynic is not necessarily a good thing. Being a cynic means you're very pessimistic and you're negative and you're always looking for the bad in things. It's very cynical. But to be a good skeptic is to be a good scientist in the very broadest sense of the word. It means you don't take anybody's word just verbatim. It means you're always looking for the evidence. You're always going to follow good scientific processes. And it's about valuing that process above any and all conclusions that might result. It doesn't matter what the conclusions are, as long as you followed a rigorous and methodical, sensible, rational, reasonable, evidence-based approach, then the conclusion is whatever it is. But being a good skeptic is following the process and prioritizing that above everything else. And that is so important in our industry, in health and fitness and sports science, because the ethos of skepticism, which is kind of what I've just described, it really is not embodied in the health and fitness industry by and large, which is where most of us are going to work or currently do work already. So we've got to embody that ethos of good skepticism and take it forward into the industry.
Yeah, and that could not agree more. I'm just checking my notes here. And so
I can expand on the idea of skepticism if you want. I'm aware that I don't want to just monologue and take up everyone's time. I want people to kind of chime in if they feel like they have something to contribute. But I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the importance of skepticism.
yeah, and I think, I mean, you brought up a good point about the difference between being a cynic and being a skeptic, because this is something I have in my notes, because it's one thing to be skeptical, but specific, and this is probably more relevant to the faculty here and yourself, Nick, having published literature and, you know, scientific papers, is during the review process, you can end up in situations like this where, you know, most of the reviewers may be not necessarily nice, but fair and skeptical. And then sometimes you get people who go out of their way to be cynical or to be, for lack of a better term, you know, assholes, because they want to pick a fight or they disagree with how you conducted your study. And so so how do we be skeptical without being cynical, or without being overly critical? Perhaps is maybe the better way to phrase it.
Yeah, and I think if anybody that's ever published any literature will understand what you mean by the kind of when you have a negative review versus a constructive review. And it's a fine line, because science is all about picking holes in things. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, take this pill, it's going to make you, you know, it's going to cut 10% off your marathon PR, or wear this running shoe, it's going to make you, you know, run 20% quicker, or follow this diet and you'll get to 6% body fat in 12 weeks. And my job as a good skeptic or a good scientist is to say, well, okay, show me your evidence, show me your research, show me your reasoning, and I'm going to try and pick holes in it. And there is no such thing as a completely foolproof, 100% robust science, but you just try and make it as foolproof as you possibly can. And you try to minimize the bias, and you try and be as objective as possible. Because in the health and fitness industry, and again, sports science and the health and fitness industry, you kind of go hand in hand. If we don't understand our own cognitive biases, then you're going to fall prey to somebody else who knows how to exploit those cognitive biases. So as a kind of a consciousness raiser, there are websites devoted to helping marketing companies understand our cognitive biases and in which specific areas we are scientifically illiterate. There are websites devoted, and you can go and look at them, don't take my word for it. There are websites devoted to helping companies to find specific athletes and celebrities to endorse their brands in order to tap into specific target audiences. So depending on which product they want to sell, it will push them to a certain athlete or a certain celebrity who can then increase their brand awareness. And I guarantee you, marketing companies understand our cognitive biases better than we do. And that is a problem. And they use that understanding to exploit those insufficiencies in order to sell product. So I can give you a couple of examples. One of the most prominent informal fallacies in sports science and health and fitness is the appeal to nature. And has anybody heard of the appeal to nature? You can nod or stick your hand up. A couple of you have. Well, I guarantee you'll have seen it. So the appeal to nature basically is, it suggests that something that is natural is inherently good, and something that's unnatural or synthetic is inherently bad, okay? So anytime you see a product that is advertised as having all natural ingredients, yeah, that's trying to exploit our cognitive bias for this kind of yearning for natural products. Or anytime you see the whole organic food industry, for example, is premised on the appeal to nature. This idea that it's natural and that it's earthy and that it's got no pesticides in it and it's you know, it's just natural and healthy and it's good for you. That's a logical fallacy, because actually when you look at it from a logical, reasonable, objective perspective, if such a thing exists, there's no reason to think that something natural is good, something unnatural is bad. I can think of plenty of examples of natural things that are bad for you. You know, arsenic, snakes, these are natural things, but they're not particularly good for you. And there are many synthetic things that are developed in a lab, certain drugs, antibiotics. Sometimes these are very good for you and critical for survival, but they're absolutely, many of them are absolutely synthetic. Think about it take a step back, and if you were to take a molecule of glucose, which has the chemical formula, anyone? Nutritionist, physiologist, C6H12O6. If you looked at it under an electron microscope, you could see the chemical structure of the glucose molecule, yeah? Now, if you get a glucose molecule that is completely natural and it's grown in nature, you extracted it from a plant, and then you got a completely synthetic glucose molecule that was created in a lab. If you look at it under the microscope, it's still got the same chemical structure, same chemical formula. And if you ingest it, it's going to have the exact same effect on the body. It's going to raise your blood sugar levels, right? But one of them is good and one of them is bad, because one is natural and one of them is synthetic. So it's about challenging the way that we conceptualize these ideas in the health and fitness industry. Because I guarantee if we'd have done a poll at the start and I said, how many of you prefer natural products to unnatural products? Everyone would have said, well, of course, I prefer to put natural products in my body any day. But why? Why? There's no logical reason why something natural is inherently good. But it's a natural ingrained bias that we have that is exploited in the health and fitness industry day after day after day to sell product. So that is one example of a cognitive bias. It's a fallacy that we have to learn how to challenge in order to navigate this minefield of a health and fitness industry. Sorry, I'm monologuing again, but I find it very interesting.
No, I mean, you're the guy who decided to sit down and write a book about the whole thing. So I guess that kind of brings me to, like, was it a series of incidents? Was there one particular thing that propelled you to do this? I think you told me that the book was a culmination of things you had kind of jotted down or experienced over the years.
Yeah, so I started, obviously I was trained as a sports scientist, and shortly after I got my master's in 2007, 2008, that's when I got into scientific skepticism. And I just found a podcast I was randomly looking for science-based podcasts on iTunes, and I found one called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. I don't know if anyone's ever listened to it, but basically it's a science-based podcast, and they talk about new discoveries and new stories and so forth. But in essence, it was a gateway for me into this movement of scientific skepticism. And the more and more I kind of went down the rabbit hole, the more I realized that the ethos of skepticism and critical thinking, everything that I've been talking about, this idea of evidence-based practice, academic integrity, prioritizing the process above the conclusions, these principles were in stark contrast to what we see in the health and fitness industry, where we have products that are not evidence-based. There's no evidence for efficacy. There are unsupported, unsubstantiated claims. And I decided that, I kind of wanted to give something back to this community, this critical thinking, scientific skepticism community, by writing the book. And so I kind of started to accumulate ideas, and I was writing lots of articles for mainstream media on critical thinking in health and fitness, and debunking products that didn't have any evidence for efficacy. And I started to think to myself, you know what, there's a book here, I'm sure there's a book here. And I just thought, rather than spend the next 3, 4, 5 years writing 50 or 60 different articles for mainstream media, why don't I put these ideas in a book? And it just, it snowballed, it avalanched from there, and the book became this huge project. And 8 years later, I kind of finished putting all my notes together and wrote the thing. And I can honestly say that it's the book I wanted to write, in that it has all the lessons in there that I've learned over the years. Not that I swear I'm not plugging the book now, but I'm just trying to give you a background as to how the thing came about. But it was everything that all the ideas and all the lessons I learned over the years, but it was also, it didn't lose my inherent sarcasm and my kind of slightly aggressive approach to debunking pseudoscience, even to the point where the publishers had to, reading the first draft of the book, they were like, Nick, you need to just bring it back a little bit because we're going to get sued. You got to just like tone it down a little bit. So I toned it down a bit, and they said a little bit more. So I really do kind of went for the jugular, and I'm pleased with it. It's the book I wanted to write.
I think it's interesting to interject. It's one of the things you said several times is, you know, as a skeptic, you know, we have to, and a scientist, we trust the process. How many times do you hear that in sport? And it's trust the process, but there's no real reason for this process. It's just what this coaching paradigm is or what this expert has developed. And so I just think it's really an interesting irony, the juxtaposition of these two. It's the same mantra that's repeated and repeated. Trust the process, but it's, as scientists and looking at things skeptically, that's what you have to do, and the results are the results. And it's our responsibility to present these regardless of whether they confirm or refute our preconceived ideas or our hypotheses. But in a training paradigm, it's like you know, as someone who is trained in various disciplines, it's like you go to your coach or whomever, whatever, and say, you know, these aspects are just, I don't know that this is optimal for whatever it is. And it's, oh, trust the process, trust the process. It's like, but I feel like I'm falling apart. Maybe not the best idea.
Yeah, and that happens a lot in sport, and you've touched on an important point, because on the one hand, no idea and no person should be above scrutiny. This is another really important takeaway from science and skepticism and critical thinking, is always question everyone and anyone. Now, there's a balance to that, because if you're, you know, ill-educated on a topic and then you start questioning a world-renowned authority, then, you know, you're treading on thin ice. However, the authority, just like anybody else, has to prove their contentions, right? So no idea and no person is above scrutiny. There's nothing good ever comes from somebody placing themselves on a pedestal whereby they can't be touched and can't be scrutinized. So that's kind of the first thing to acknowledge. And I always say, when I was teaching, I would say to my students, don't take my word for it. Question what I'm telling you as well. Go and do your own research. And hopefully your research will confirm what I'm telling you. But don't assume that what I'm telling you is correct, because even authorities can make mistakes. The other thing is that trusting the process is only a good it's only a good method when it works. And so we can have confidence in the scientific process because it works. There's a great quote by Richard Dawkins. If you've never seen it, go and look it up, because I won't do it justice. But somebody asks Richard Dawkins, who's a professor of evolutionary biology in Oxford, and they say, how can you trust the scientific method? And what's the proof that the scientific method is robust? And he says, well, if you base medicine on science, you cure people, you know, you cure them, they get better from their illness. If you base planes on science, they fly. If you base rockets on science, they fly to the moon. It works. And then there's another bit which I won't add on. You have to go and look that up. But there are instances where it doesn't work. So, for example, Jamie brought up this instance where athletes are being trained by a coach who are consistently banging this drum that follow the process. Well, does the process work? If it doesn't, okay, you may be getting results, but often many athletes have to fall apart and get injured and have their careers demolished because they're following this one process, and that process may not work for everyone. So that's about individualizing training programs, and perhaps that's a slightly different discussion.
Well, it fits into the bigger picture, and I can't remember if I told the students this before everybody joined in or if I said it when everybody was here, but we're seeing that happen with the nutrition field, and moving from the one diet fits all template to personalized nutrition, and we're seeing the same thing in sports science and whatnot as well. We still have the public health guidelines on physical activity and whatnot, but more and more we're starting to see more individualization of those guidelines, and more catering to individual needs or preferences, as opposed to just saying everybody's going to do 150 minutes of exercise a week, and you're going to do cardio 3 days, and you're going to lift weights 2 days, or something like that, which is what I think the guidelines recommend as they currently sit. But they're starting to incorporate more options for individual needs, and I think that's part of where we're kind of going to be heading as a field, is looking at the more personalized or the individualized stuff. But again, when we look at where athletes get their information, for example, or even the general public, most people don't get it or get the information from people who are actually qualified. So if you look at their best example, recent example I can give is that a group out of the UK did a study looking at did a survey looking at CBD use in elite level rugby players. And I don't remember the exact specifics, but a big portion of their sample, which was like 400 or 500 players, or maybe it wasn't that many, most of the information came from the internet, coaches, or teammates. Physios, which is what they call physical therapists in the rest of the English speaking world, nutritionist, as well as they weren't on the list, or they were all the way down towards the bottom. So the people who should be providing this information, or who should be a go-to source of this information, are not the people being consulted by athletes or coaches or players. And now I'm kind of the one monologuing, but I don't know if you want to piggyback off of that at all, Nick, or otherwise I'm ready to move us on to our next discussion item.
No, I can dwell on this just for a sec, because this is crucial, and I've sort of already touched on it and had my moan about social media. Like, everyone's on social media, and it's a necessary evil in today's society. But as I alluded to earlier, internet and social media have exploded at such a rate that it outstrips our ability to navigate social media in a safe and effective way. And they've studied this quite closely, and that misinformation and bad advice spreads much more quickly than good advice and good information. And that's because everybody likes to spread sensationalist gossip. Everyone likes a gossip, everyone likes a big story. And that's the stuff that spreads more quickly on social media. And we kind of try and operate in this sphere of influencers. You can go on, who's on Instagram? Quick show of hands. Yeah, me, I'm on it. Twitter. Everyone's on Facebook, I guess. Yeah. Facebook less so, but Twitter and Instagram are both absolutely huge. And in terms of influencing large populations, Instagram is far and away the biggest offender, because the people that have the biggest platforms are usually the people that don't necessarily deserve them. They're models or they're celebrities or they're athletes who are paid, literally paid, to have product placement on their pages, on their sites. Just did a quick search on my phone here. Anybody heard of the body coach, Joe Wicks? He's huge in the UK. Maybe he hasn't made it over to the States. He was just the first one that came to mind. And his Twitter bio is on a mission to make the world fitter, healthier, and happier. And he's got 415,000 followers. And he's written a bunch of best-selling books. And he talks about health and nutrition and training and so forth. And he's got a 2-1 from St. Mary's University in London in kinesiology. That's his qualification. That's his only qualification. And then he was a personal trainer for, I think, 6 months. And then he somehow just made it big, and he started writing books, and he got lots of followers on Twitter. And, you know, by contrast, a friend of mine who's got 20 years of experience in the industry, he's got a master's and a PhD in applied sports nutrition. And he's worked with some of the world's best athletes, and he's worked in professional football and soccer, and he's got 250 followers on Twitter. And so that's just, I know that these are examples at two ends of the extreme, but people on social media who have all the influence are not necessarily the people that should have all the influence. Social media gives anybody a platform to spread any information that they want. And that's not to say that my friend Joe Wicks here is necessarily giving bad advice, but the takeaway is that Twitter followers are not credentials. That's all I have to say about that.
Have you guys seen Sweeney Todd?
Yes.
No. Oh my gosh, never mind. I feel like you are like Sweeney Todd when he's like when they're selling the miracle elixir, and he's trying to credit them. He's more. That's what it looks like.
Maybe I should rebrand myself as like the Sweeney Todd of sports science.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll look into that.
All right, so we're getting a little towards the end here. So I had just kind of 3 more things, but I'm gonna jump over one. And you have been involved with STORK, if I am not mistaken, the Society for Transparency, Openness, and Replication in Kinesiology.
Yes, loosely, not actively.
Loosely, okay.
I'm aware of it, and I know people that operate within it.
So I guess just then, as a follow-up to that, what changes might you like to see in research and maybe communication practices in our field within the next 5 years to get us into maybe a better position? Like, is there something at the root level in the field we need to change, or, you know, what do we need to do to become better at incorporating evidence-based practice into sport and exercise science?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the first one is, I'll start with the most mundane one, and that is, I think we need to implement broader critical thinking education at grassroots level. I don't know what the system is like in the US, but in the UK, you can go through your entire high school and college education, do all this scientific training, and not actually have any formal instruction on critical thinking. And science and critical thinking, obviously there's a huge overlap, but they can work mutually, they can be mutually exclusive. Okay, so for example, I know of several medical doctors who obviously have medical degrees. They're practicing doctors. They implement evidence-based practice or science-based medicine, but they are also homeopaths. So they prescribe homeopathic remedies as well. Now that's quite rare, granted, to have a medical doctor who's also a homeopath. And for those of you who don't know, homeopathy is a widely discredited alternative medicine. And this, you know, it's been studied well, and it doesn't work. It violates the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. It's pseudoscience. but there are on occasion medical doctors with all their training and all of their knowledge and understanding who are also pseudoscientists, which is, I used to work with a dietitian who had a degree and a master's in dietetics and had 15 years of experience working with elite athletes. She worked in commercial science, excellent dietitian, but she believed that the moon landing was a hoax. She didn't think that we landed on the moon. Now, I know that's got nothing to do with sports science, but I'm giving you examples of people who in their day-to-day jobs are obviously good scientists and are obviously good at their jobs and follow evidence-based practice and are critical thinkers in their very narrow domain of work. You shift them just a little bit outside of that and their critical faculties just crumble. So critical thinking needs to be embedded in as a discipline in and of its own right very early on. So that's the first one. The second one is, I think scientists and academics and practitioners need to replace journalists by and large in science reporting. The standard of science reporting is abysmal because most of the people writing about science are not scientists. They don't understand the science and they don't understand the complex nuances of understanding research. Even going and looking at some of the really well-respected science outlets, you know, like Scientific American and New Scientist, the crap that they publish, honestly, it's just awful because most of the people that they like to get to write for them are not scientists, they're journalists. Journalists are interested in likes and shares and retweets and subscriptions. And when that is your priority, then the ethos of academic integrity is going to be compromised. So I would like to see more scientists and academics and people with science training doing more of the writing in the mainstream media. And the last thing is I would like to see a little bit more self-policing on the side of scientists in terms of policing their colleagues and their peers. You know, obviously we have the peer review process, which is manifest, it's self-policing, but I'd like to see people taking on their colleagues and not being afraid to challenge authorities within their academic institutions if they believe that there isn't good practice going on, and if they see bad science going on in the institute, whether it's a university or in applied practice. I think science is one of its greatest strengths is its ability to self-correct. So if the evidence points this way, then that's the way we're going to go. And if a great new study comes along that shifts the needle in the other direction, then scientists have to be humble enough to put their hands up and go, you know what, we got it wrong, let's change direction. And that is science's greatest strength. So I'd like to see more self-policing from, you know, among scientists who work in the industry. So those are the three things I'd like to see change.
I think those are all great points. And, you know, especially the last one, you know, you really hit on, and I think it's one we've definitely not been great about, is that, yeah, self-policing, like you said, you know, because it's very easy to see or to hear other studies that are going on that, or questionable research practices like graph scaling or data filtering or data mining and all kinds of things that you guys as grad students will learn about a bit more as we go through this semester. So I just have one kind of final ending thing for you, Nick, and then if any of the students or anybody has other questions they'd like to ask. So for the students who are embarking on their research career, starting the first year of their master's degree, which our program is a 2-year program, and our students are all required to do some sort of research component, what would you offer as kind of a key takeaway or an important kind of lesson for them to be cognizant about for their future as they grow as researchers in this field?
Okay, I had like 20 came into my head, so I've tried to narrow it down to I guess the one important takeaway. I think for me, it's about the key thing in science is, as I've just mentioned, being humble enough to question your own pre-existing beliefs. And a good scientist or a good skeptic or a good critical thinker should always be able to spin on a dime and change their mind if new evidence comes to light. And a big part of that is about losing your ego. And I don't mean the Freudian analytical ego. I mean that sense of yourself that never wants to be wrong. You know, we're all human and nobody likes to be proven wrong. We all like to be right, and we can get into vicious arguments trying to prove ourselves right. But I think if there was one takeaway as you embark on a research career, or to be good researchers or good skeptics or critical thinkers, is to always try and prove yourself wrong first. And then if your argument or your position or your perception holds up to scrutiny, then it's robust enough to hold on to. But don't go into it trying to prove yourself right. And by the same token, if you meet somebody who has an opposing opinion to you, try and understand their opinion. Look at their perspective. Be generous. Don't assume that they're wrong. Be generous with opposing opinions, and then you're more likely to stand a good chance of getting to the truth of the matter. That the priority should always be finding out what the truth is rather than finding out that you're right. Because sometimes you're wrong, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that was one section I have kind of skimmed through. The discussion of taking the ego out of the equation, I think, is super, super important. And just to kind of hit on some of the points, some of the, you know, subtitles of this area that this chapter in his book are, you know, free yourself, yearn to learn, it's okay to defer, knowledge of ignorance, be ready and willing to change your mind. You know, these are all important things that we should embrace as scientists and clinicians. Yeah, no, that's great. So I have another meeting in about 10 minutes. So that's about how much time we have for any questions or further discussion. So feel free, I mean, there's not that many of us, so I think you're probably okay to just unmute yourself and, you know, any questions or discussion or points that you'd like to bring up.
I need to have you talk to my family.
I'm not sure I want to take that on, the way that you phrased that. It's a difficult one. I mean, do you mind sharing your personal situation? Are they're not critical thinkers, I'm guessing?
So interestingly enough, they're very, 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 very intelligent individuals, but they use they have a very interesting viewpoint on health. So everything else, they're very objective, but as soon as it comes to health, because I can't think of one family member that doesn't have type 2 diabetes or who isn't obese. And so when I try to help them out, I may come off like a little bit of an asshole, but it's kind of what they need. They need the objective, plain truth, and they always argue. There's no amount of research, because I've printed journal articles on how to combat, and it's like obvious, but how to combat against depression, obesity, things like that. Her doctor, I've seen give them printed out journal articles on it as well. But it's just like when we talk about it, they don't believe it. They don't believe it. It's weird. Or there is a reason as to why they can't do it, an excuse as to why they can't get to it. Always an excuse. That's one. Oh, my foot hurts.
Yeah, and I think the situation you're describing is kind of reminiscent of, it could be almost any situation where somebody has already made up their mind about something. You know, whether it's an anti-vaxxer or you know, somebody who has a political, ideological bias, or you know, carbohydrate, low carb, keto fanatic. They've already made up their mind, and in those instances, no amount of evidence is going to change somebody's mind. There's a great quote by Jonathan Swift, and that is, you can't reason somebody out of a position that they didn't first reason themselves into. And so you can throw as much evidence and as many papers and statistics at somebody as you like. They've already made up their mind. They've made a decision to glaze over when it comes to evidence. So you kind of have to take a different approach, because all you're going to do with bombarding them with this stuff is make them, they're going to dig their heels in, right? So all you can do is try something a little bit more subtle. You can plant some seeds, you know, be a little bit more tactful. You can try something called defeasibility, which I write about, which is asking somebody what would have to happen for them to change their mind about something.
Yeah.
So what evidence would they have to see? Who would they need to speak to? What scenario would have to, you know, occur for them to question their position? And if they respond by saying, well, nothing, no scenario will make me change my position, then you're dealing with somebody who's a closed book. They've got an ideological bias. They're never going to change their mind. But if you can just get them to just cleave just a little bit of room for doubt, you get them to question just a little bit, then more often than not, they will take those first, second, third steps by themselves. But trying to throw evidence at them, it probably won't work. You just have to try and get them just to be tactful, try and get them to doubt themselves a little bit, and then they'll probably, hopefully, try and take the additional steps themselves, in my experience.
I like that.
To dovetail a little bit off of that, it's most of us in general don't respond well to have when somebody just comes at us with telling and saying, here's what's true. Well, even if they're 100% right, it's immediately the walls go up, the defenses go up, and it's like, well, who made you the king? Like, what? Like, and so it may be more beneficial to ask questions, to make it a conversation where you offer them an opportunity to talk about what their point is, how they got there, because sometimes just allowing someone to talk, so, oh, tell me a little bit more about that. How did, you know, and just asking. So it's as they say something, it's like repeat the last 2 or 3 words of what they said as a question. And so it's you're prompting them to talk because you hear yourself as you speak, and it's can happen that people kind of hear, yeah, I guess that doesn't totally make sense. Oh, I guess that I don't know how I really got here. And if it's a conversation where you are allowing them to have a valid point, they may allow you to also have a valid point. And so you're probably not going to convince them in the first go. You can say everything as eloquently as you possibly can, but if they have a very entrenched belief, you know, it comes to health and someone is unhealthy, it's like, well, there's a reason and it's not my fault. Because that's a hard thing to come up against, that I have made poor decisions in my life that have led to these health problems that I'm having. You know, we don't like to be wrong. We don't like things to be our fault. But creating a conversation and just leaving things unresolved, which doesn't always feel good for those of us who like definitive resolution to things, but it's play the long game and leave the window open for future conversation.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
All right, I'd love to take more questions, but I need to go, so I'm going to have to end the meeting. Nick, I really appreciate your time and joining us. I don't know if you want to share your social media, or if you're okay with me giving your email out to anybody who might want to reach out to you for any questions or follow-up they might have.
Yeah, if anybody's on Twitter, at nbtiller is my Twitter, and look, find out more about the work I'm doing on my website, which is nbtiller.com. Please get my email from Matt if you do have any questions. I'd love to engage with you guys about this stuff. I'm obviously very interested in it. So just be careful, don't get me started. It's probably my best advice. But thanks for having me. I had a great time. I hope you can take something away from it too.
Nope, we were glad you could join us, and I appreciate you taking your time. And I will see you guys all next Friday. And Nick, hopefully, we'll be able to keep in touch.
Thank you,
For
Jamie.
sure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, guys.
Thank you.
Dr. Tiller, thank you
Yeah.
so much for the opportunity to learn from you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt
Welcome.
Becker.
Sweet. Okay.